Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jan Metzger. I run TMT Investment Banking for Credit Suisse in Asia Pacific. It's my great honor today to introduce Christian Lanng, the co-founder and chairman of Tradeshift. And what he's going to talk about today is how his very successful startup company is disrupting much bigger players and what that means in his particular industry. So I'd like to invite Christian up on the stage to tell us about that.
Thank you. So it's a great honor to be here. I'm normally not used to this many suits in the room, talking in Silicon Valley. And I'm going to be talking about a topic that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about. We work with global Fortune 500 companies all over the world, very well-known brands, very large companies. And as I've been working with these companies, I really started to think about what's happening to them. Because Fortune 500 is being disrupted across the board right now. And it's not just startups coming up, but it's also whole industries changing, collapsing, merging. I'm working with customers that are changing, so who used to be the customers are now the competitors, and who used to be the suppliers are now the customers. So across the board, we see massive disruption, and I call it the death of big business as we know it, and I think there'll be something else after it. I don't know exactly what that will be, but I'm certain that the existing models are going to go away. And a little bit about me. I founded Tradeshift 5.5 years ago. I sit on the Global Agenda Council for the Future of Software and Technology. I've been working with software my whole life. I did my first startup when I was 19. So it's sort of in my lifeblood to just build companies and try to see if we can't disrupt something. If we look at how big business used to work, it was pretty simple. This is Porter's value chain. I think you all had it in school or seen it before. We have input, which is the production of materials, supply chain, handling all of the logistics around it. And then we have output, which is the marketing and sales. This is how most big companies are actually organized today. You can go in and you can find most of the departments aligned after this structure. But then this happened. And this is Moore's Law. And what is really interesting about Moore's Law is it's been extremely consistent. Over the last 30 years, we've been able to constantly double the amount of computing power we have at the same cost. And while that sounds impressive, and I think we all have an idea what that means, we're sitting here with iPads, which is, of course, as fast as the computers we used to have. There was heavy laptops. To really get a sense of the scale, the CPU that's inside an iPhone today, which cost around $300, cost $54 million in '94 when the US company, they bought a supercomputer that could do the same. Now think about how many things in the world that in less than 15 years falls from $54 million to $300. That kind of value add you don't really see anywhere else. And what's happening is, for the last 10 years, we've seen this as becoming faster computers, faster internet, faster phones, things we can sort of predict. And I think when we think in our head for the next 10 years, oh yeah, it's just going to be even faster smartphones, it's going to be even smartwatches, all of these things. But what's really happening is that Moore's Law is starting to bleed out in the physical world. And it's affecting the physical world. So what we're dealing with is exponential innovation. So if we think about that for a second, 3D printers, the toys that we saw like 2 or 3 years ago, printing small, cute plastic figures. Well, just in December, this is the world's first 3D printed car. Complete end-to-end, all parts manufactured on a 3D printer. Siemens are now doing 3D printed spare parts for their windmills on the offshore farms because it's cheaper to print in steel near the facilities than it is to having a huge warehouse of stock with very expensive spare parts sitting around. If you stop for a second and start to think about what this will do to logistics supply chains all over the world, as we get better at this is just the beginning, and it's happening a lot faster than any other technologies that get introduced. Another example is new manufacturing robotics. So this robot is a manufacturing robot. It's from a company called Rethinking Robotics. It has artificial intelligence or deep learning algorithms inside, so it can learn on the fly. And what's great about it is you can take it by the hand, and then you can show it the moves it has to do. You don't need like a huge team of engineers coming in and setting up your robotics for your manufacturing line. You buy one of these, you take it by the hand, and you show it what to do, which means robotic manufacturing is now available to even very small shops. It's available to anyone. We all know these. This is Google's self-driving cars. 5 years ago, when Google they built these, the car industry was laughing. How stupid can Google be to put a $70,000 sensor on top of a car? It's a LiDAR, which is a laser-assisted radar that collects 1.3 trillion data points per second around the car, which is a little better than a human driver. It's processing it in real time, and when it came out first 5 years ago, it was basically military hardware, except the military didn't have stuff that good. And here's what happened. So the whole car industry said, Google has picked the completely wrong strategy towards self-driving cars. Nobody can afford this. In December, I got this. This is Google's prototype Tango tablet. It has the same sensor. Only difference is it costs $1,000. So what Google is doing is they're betting on this exponential innovation. And if you look at Google in every single bet they're making across the board, they're betting on Moore's law. And they know it will work out for them in the long run. And what you're seeing is that most traditional companies, they bet on the curves they know, which is 10 to 20% improvement per year. They don't understand that the whole underlying foundation has switched to something that's exponential. So this is causing havoc across the board. I was talking to a car company's CFO for a very well-known big car company. They're one of the leaders in self-driving cars. They're catching up to Google. And they said, this is really great. We think we can create the safest cars in the world that will never crash because the AI will take over and prevent all of the stupid stuff that humans they tend to do in cars. The only problem is we're making 90% of our profits on spare parts. And if cars don't crash, we don't sell spare parts. So we really don't know what our business is once we do this. And we don't have a choice either, because if we don't do this, we won't be in the market in 5 years. Right? So really what's happening is that exponential innovation is very hard to predict. And there's this lovely story about the guy who invents the chess game in China, and he comes to the emperor, and the emperor says, this is a lovely game. I really like it. I would give you a reward. What would you like? And he say, I'm just a humble guy. I would like a little rice from my village. Can I get 1 corn of rice on the first field of the chessboard, 2 corns for the next? And when you get to the end of it, it's 5 times the rice that is in the world. And the guy, he loses his head for that little thing. But the point is, the emperor, he couldn't predict the second half of the chessboard. And the last 10 years of innovation, the last 10 years of computing, has been the first half of the chessboard. And we're making a grave mistake if we think the next 10 years is going to be like the last 10 years. Because what you're facing is exponential innovation. It's just like that chessboard. It's 5 times the rise in the world. We cannot predict what happened on that second half. But there are some things we can see. So input into the supply chain. The fact that I used to invest 10% of my resources into R&D, I would get some returns around 10% better materials every year, 10% better products, was very predictable. I could invest in my supply chain, I could invest in my production, and I would get a certain outcome. But the problem now is input has become unstable. There are such huge jumps in technologies, in production methods, and so on, so my input is unstable. And to give you some ideas of that, Tesla completely circumvented the whole car manufacturing supply chain by using parts from computers in their cars. Because the innovation curve for computers was so much faster than the innovation curve for cars. That's the foundation of most of what Tesla do, is they go to other technologies. Exactly the same thing that Elon Musk did with SpaceX, by the way. They use commoditized computer parts in their rockets rather than building very heavy-duty, specialized things, which means his innovation curve is a lot faster. Another example is material innovation. Material innovation is no longer like, oh, we'll get a little bit better rubber, we'll get a little bit better nylon. It's about whole new materials, using nanotechnology, using biomimicry, where we look at how animals they act, which has led to a complete revolution in most material science, which has led to a complete revolution in most areas around fashion, sports, and so on. Very different materials today than just 5 years ago. Everybody can produce. 3D printers, they're toys, but right now are still toys, but within the next 5 years, everybody will have the capability to produce and build things. I was having the discussion with a very famous fashion brand and asking them about, how do you feel about your shoes being pirate copied on home printers in 5 years? And they said, we're kind of expecting it, and we hope our digital brand will be strong enough that we can sell people digital shoes. That's talking about the whole input becoming completely unstable. What you think about today as your supply chain might not exist in 5 years. That might be turned on the head. The other side of the equation is the demand. We used to be able to predict that if we invest a certain amount in marketing, we would get a certain return. But I just spent time with a car company again who said, American teenagers don't want cars. It's not on the top 10 list of things they want when they got 18 for the first time in 30 years. In fact, teenagers don't really want to own anything. They want access. I mean, why own a car if I can get an Uber app and I can get a car in 3 minutes? It's a very silly thing to own. Our generations, we are still obsessed with having things, owning things, having nice interiors in our houses. The next generation's not so much. And most manufacturing companies, most retailers, most big companies in the world better figure this out really fast. That the whole next generation is switching from ownership to access. And that's why there's a generation of startups wreaking havoc on most of these industries. I was talking to said car company, and they said, we think Uber could be a really good customer of ours. We could sell them cars. I was saying, are you kidding yourself? They're your biggest competitor. Cars spend 94% of the time parked. If we all used Uber, we could produce 94% less cars. That's not a very fun scenario for most car companies in the world. So other examples is, this is another car company, who lost $600 million because they couldn't predict the short-term demand. They do planning cycles 5 years out where they predict what is going to be the long-term demand. They build up stock, warehouses, production capacities for the long-term demand. But 2 social media campaigns, not by them, completely wreaked havoc on all of the demand. So one car that didn't expect to do well did much better than they expected, but they could not deliver the parts, they could not deliver the interior, so they lost a ton of orders. And another car they thought would do very well got a very bad review, which went viral. So the other side of the equation is you cannot predict the output any longer either. So you have unstable input and you have unstable output. And the conclusion is sort of like almost everybody is screwed. and the companies that are being commoditized, they're screwed, like logistics. You know, from the top, the customers, they're now running their own logistic business, and from the bottom, you have Uber and apps like that coming up. So completely commoditized industry. Manufacturing, all margins are shrinking. They're trying to become managed services. They're changing the industry completely. They want to be something else. You have companies like Rolls-Royce who sell jet engines by the hour now instead of selling you the jet engine. You will see a lot more companies like that. But that means they completely got to change industries. Huge fashion brands who used to be channel businesses, then they became retailers, and within the next 5 years, they're going to be e-commerce businesses. That's like changing your whole business every 5 years. So both sides of the equation have changed radically. This is unpredictable, and this is unpredictable. And we're left with something in the middle that is not really fit for whatever is happening on both sides. And of course, the result is things like this. You know, companies that can't predict the direction, they can't predict the market, they can't predict the demand, they can't predict the input, and they're just stuck because the supply chain and the whole structure is built up in a certain way. So why is it we end up here? Why is it we see again and again that the largest companies in the world, they cannot really react to disruption, they cannot really react to this kind of competition, they can't really react to this kind of changing landscape? So I think one thing to look at is, what do startups do? What do companies like Uber, Airbnb, Google, all of these companies do? Well, they are highly iterative. Actually, most people, they think startups, they're extremely good at product innovation, but what they got to be a lot better at is process innovation. In my own company, we've gone from 0 employees to 300 employees in 5 global locations in 4 years. We're doubling our employee size roughly every year. We are building out infrastructure in 5 markets in parallel. We cannot, any process we have today, we know we're going to completely tear apart and have a new process in 1 year. And we don't try to plan for scale, because planning will always fail. So we wait for our systems to break down, and then we iterate very fast. Large companies, they try to plan 5 years out. They try to build for capacity 5 years out, and then the world has changed 1 year after. And you're left with a huge gap. This is the core model for startup innovation. You have an idea, you build, you have a product, you measure the impact of this product, and you get some data out and you learn from that. And it's a very, very rapid cycle. At our company at Tradeshift, we deploy our software twice a week. And we measure the business impact for our customers twice a week. SAP upgrades roll out typically every 7 years. Do you think your company changed in 7 years? It should. It should change every week. So this is what large companies, they do. They can't change because they don't have any capacity for process innovation. They don't, all of their processes are stuck. I'll give you another example. So again, a very well-known fashion brand, they had a factory in China. They want to move to the Philippines. It took them 3.5 months to move all of the physical infrastructure, procure the machines, set up the lighting, the software systems, everything. It took them 18 months to change the supporting SAP process before they could go live. 3.5 months to move all of the physical infrastructure, 18 months to change the digital process to support this physical move. So how on earth did we end up in a place where our digital processes were more stuck, harder to change, and much more costly to change than our physical infrastructure? By the way, this change cost them $100 million, which was like, a good sizable chunk out of the total budget of doing this. And really the reason is that we're optimizing for cost, not change. The last 20 years, you've seen management consultants run around to company after company, software companies running around to company after company and saying, invest in infrastructure that will cut your cost of transaction. Invest in infrastructure that will lower your total costs. And do this by standardizing, by outsourcing, and by rolling in software that will standardize your whole business. I mean, this is SAP's mantra. Buy a best practice template from SAP. If you're a brewery, buy the SAP brewery template. And that's a static thing. So once you have this, you can't really change. You're locked into this very static model of how a business should run. And you're really dependent on buying a new version of this to get any kind of process innovation. So we got stuck in our software. And it's almost impossible to change because we optimized for an extremely low cost of transaction. And the only way you can do that is to say the future is predictable. We think the future today will be the same as in 10 years, so we'll outsource all of our people, we'll standardize all of our processes, and we'll just run it one way. And obviously, in the world around ERP, the world is changing very fast. You have a millennial workforce. 40% of the millennial workforce have used tablets or smartphones as their main computing device the last 5 years. Try to pop them in front of an SAP screen and see what happens. Social media is the default. We all connect on LinkedIn, all of these things. Cloud and big data have just driven down the cost of running, executing software, but also running and executing change dramatically. How often do you change your Facebook profile? How often do you change content on your smartphone? And that's another point. The way we are consuming software today is radically different from the way our business software systems are built. There are 1.2 million apps in Apple's App Store with 20 billion paid out to developers. These numbers are already very outdated because they're 6 months old. This was an industry that did not exist in 2007. So as consumers, we trained ourselves that we can activate a new application, we can use new software in less than 30 seconds, we can figure out if we like it or not, and then we can throw it out. Try to install a new module on your SAP Oracle system. It's 9 months and it's 50 or 100 million, right? So it's very, very different how we consume. The millennial workforce, the millennials, they will dominate the workforce. And not only do they have expectations around what software is, what processes is, but they also have expectations about their jobs. They want meaningful jobs. They don't want to work in the back office. They want to be engaged in the business, and they want to drive value for the business. So if you want the next generations of talent, you better make sure that your internal processes are in a place where this talent want to work for you. Social media is pervasive to our lives. And I think, we say, oh, this is a joke. That has nothing to do with business, right? But in China, I can now get my payroll on WeChat. I can pay in McDonald's with it. I was actually joking with one of our big customers that they probably had better luck reaching their suppliers in China on WeChat than in the SAP system they were trying to roll out. Jokes aside, so 97% of the internet users in China in the business side, they have a smartphone, and 93% have a tablet, but 60% have a PC. But all of the Western business processes, they're built with the starting point that, of course, we all have PCs. That's how we do business, right? So mobile will soon rule the world. It's already inverted in most emerging markets, so mobile is way ahead of PC penetration. And yeah, so here's what's really happening is that we have these old ERP systems. We have these static ways of doing business, this idea that everything is running on a central database. And the attacks, of course, has started on this model pretty early on. So Salesforce was one of the first pioneers. They sliced out a small core around the sales team. You have companies like NetSuite and Workday taking out HR, trying to put it to the cloud. But fundamentally, they haven't changed the model. We're just taking the central database and we moved it to the cloud. And where we come from is really with a very different idea. It's a different idea not just from how the software should be run, but it's also a different philosophy about what should be the value or the output of the software. Because SAP is built to optimize the value, or not even optimize the value, to reduce the risk of one unit in the value chain, which is your company. The way we think about it is to say, you know, DHL, any kind of our customers, it's not about optimizing the value just for DHL. It's about optimizing the value for the whole value chain. And I think we're way too bad to think about what does the whole value chain mean. Until we see quality defects costing companies their lives, until we see huge scandals in China around milk powder that hasn't gone through proper quality control. Then we think about the supply chain, then we think about the value chain. And a lot of this is happening because the underlying processes is built for one company only, built for one internal thing. But today, modern supply chains are part of the company. They're part of the business process. And we're moving them so rapidly in and out. We have complete parts of our supply chain that's producing what used to be in-house. But we're not running our systems like they're part of us. Because the philosophy behind these big databases, the philosophy behind these big ERP systems is, it's your world and everybody on the outside is the enemy, we've got to fight. So really there's a different mindset behind this. We're trying to be more like LinkedIn, be more like Facebook. If you think about LinkedIn, there's so many different ways I can use LinkedIn. I can be a person with a career who's just trying to build my career network. I can be a recruiter looking for talent. I can be an advertiser trying to build content. And the idea with a network is everybody can have their own view on this network. Everybody can use this network in different ways. And exactly the same with Tradeshift as a business network. The CFO, he can get all of the data he needs to do his risk prevention. But the CEO can also get all of the data he needs to run his business better. When did you last meet a CEO of a big company who could articulate what is the value for SAP for his company? Clearly. He can't because it's a tool for the CFO. It's a tool for the CFO that's built to be top-down, to be hierarchical. It has thousands of people just inputting data without adding value back to them. And that's a great model when labor was cheap, when people wanted to do these kind of things, and when we could build everything hierarchical, top-down. But our business needs are rapidly changing. Our landscape is rapidly changing. The talent pool is rapidly changing. So that's why we came with a network approach and said, let's build software like it was a network from the beginning. Let's assume that it's not just about one company, but about the whole value chain. And let's make it mobile first. Let's start by assuming that every single business process will happen on a mobile phone before it happens on a desktop. And we've been quite successful. We are 4.5 years old. And we attracted some pretty big brands, some of the largest companies in the world. And we're working with them to transform their complete supply chain, how they're interacting with their suppliers. And in less than 4.5 years, we attracted 500,000 suppliers by making it easy for them to connect, by giving value back to the supply chain, and working with all of our customers to spread that value, and not just think about one unit in that whole system. And one of the great things about doing business in this way is it's spread a lot faster. So I'll give you an example. We got very early on, we got a huge logistics company called Kuehne+Nagel as a customer. And within 6 months, another big logistics company came to us and said, we think we should do business with you as well. Because 30% of our supply chain overlap with Kuehne+Nagel's supply chain. And if they're already taking the cost of onboarding their suppliers, since yours is an open platform, we want to connect with them too. So now we had 2 of the largest logistics companies in the world on our network, and today we have 5. Because guess what? The other 3, they immediately saw it's the same supply chain. So the network effects of doing business in this way is very, very different from the single point of sale of a huge, costly ERP system. But what's also interesting is that everybody is saving as you're doing this. The data that you used to have to assemble, put inside your ERP system and store and maintain yourself is now distributed out in a huge network where every single participant takes care of their part. So you get real-time data, you get fresh data, you get the ability to change fast because you can just deploy new processes as apps on top of this network. So with this in mind, I just want to show you a little bit about how we've done it. So for this logistics company, we onboarded 8,000 suppliers in a very short amount of time. For this huge leading athletic apparel manufacturer, we did 94% of their supply chain in North America in less than 15 months. In the same, no, sorry, not in the same time period. Before that, they had connected in total over the last 4 years, 350 suppliers. The difference between having all of your suppliers and all of your supply chain connected and just a tiny part is the difference between night and day in running your business. They now have real-time data on every single step in the process. They have real-time data on every single decision they make from a process perspective, how that impacts their supply chain, how they can run it better. They are now doing weekly iterations where they're allowing the people on the front line, empowering them to think about better ways they can run their business and implement those changes weekly and see the effect. So with that, I really just want to sort of summarize. If you're one of these companies caught in this huge changing landscape, what should you do? And I said in the beginning, I think everybody is screwed. Even the companies who's doing very well is screwed. If you take companies like Apple, they're doing amazing. But how on earth are they going to replicate the iPhone success? You can take companies like IKEA and other companies that are just growing like mad. Because demand is also unstable. Access over ownership. Do I really need to own furniture in the future? All of these things is things you've got to figure out if you want to continue your growth. So it doesn't matter if you're doing well or you're doing bad, you're screwed. So I think there are some things you can do. The first one is invest in capability to change. And get away from this mad, manic idea that it's just about cutting costs. I would say that high capability of change at low cost of change is much more important than just having a low cost of transaction. A low cost of transaction is sort of just cutting your legs off and then saying it's extremely cheap because I don't have to move. Consolidate your buying power. This is something that most large companies forget. You have scale. All of these startups coming from below, we are tiny. We don't have scale. I can't produce at your cost. So at least use your scale. And most companies, you'll be horrified to see how distributed that is, how little control they have over the buying power. And there's another reason you want to control your buying power. Within the next 5 years, you might realize that your supply chain is, in fact, not your supply chain, but your customers. And you want to turn your whole business around to deal with that. So having them connected and having your scale consolidated is a way to do that. Be ready to be a new business every 5 years. So one company we work with, they changed the business 3 times the last 15 years, end to end. They tried to bolt all of those changes into the same SAP system with the consequence that they couldn't run it anymore. It was just too complex. It was broken apart. So how will you be able to change your business every 5 years? And if you're looking at companies, how will those companies be able to change their business every 5 years? Because if they're not, they're going to get eaten alive in the environment we are in right now. So that was a little bit about disruption, some of the things that I'm seeing in big business. And obviously, I'm happy to take any questions in the session that follows. So remember, start with ideas, build, have a product, measure, data, learn. And this goes both for your processes, and this goes for your products. This is how startups, they do it. Thank you.
So Christian, thank you very much for that. I wanted to start you off with a philosophical question.
Yes.
Right? So you've talked about disrupting, things becoming more on demand. You're talking about Kuehne+Nagel as logistics, for example. The average Uber driver controls himself. So he's a small company of one, and he's got a platform doing something which is big. So in the long run, the same can happen in logistics and many other industries. So the philosophical question is, with all this disruption, what's the average company size going to be in the long run here?
I think that's an interesting question. I'm a sociologist by education,
yeah.
and I specialized in network theory. And I think one of the things is that systems, they tend to find the scale that work best in a given environment. And I think large structures work very well in an industrial past. When organizing huge labor forces, when organizing very, very heavy capital expenditures was the way to go. But today I can reach the same scale, same results with much, much lesser units. So I think we will tend to see that large companies will become much more networked. We're in fact already seeing it. So a lot of the airline companies, big parts of their supply chain is now completely outsourced and integrated. Some of our customers is now outsourcing the innovation. So they're expecting the material vendors to bring 20 or 30% innovation in materials every year. So we are seeing this crumpling of the big entities, and we're looking much more at networks. It's already happening.
Okay. So a size?
I don't know. I think we will probably see it keep going down, and we'll keep breaking apart as it makes sense and as new technologies come out. But yeah, I can't say like any particular size. I think.
Well, appreciate that. I was want to actually open up the questions to the audience a little bit. Does the gentleman here has a question?
That was a really fascinating talk. I think my question more had to do with your point on cost versus change optimization. I mean, I guess thinking from a viewpoint of a consultant, I definitely agree with your point on how it's a flaw, kind of recommending something like SAP and cutting off your legs on being optimizing for change. But I was guessing my question has to do with what kind of specific examples did you have for what recommendations to suggest as a consultant from that viewpoint?
I think the first thing is, I think we're so used to getting up with the answers. Like, a company has a problem. They're being outcompeted in a certain sector, something is happening, and we think as consultants or vendors that it's our job to come up with a solution. I think we got to get away from that because typically there's not going to be one solution. And I think especially the large companies, they will need to learn to experiment and do thousands of things very rapidly and figure out what sticks. In a way, if you want to model, and I don't know, I still think it's unproven if she'll succeed, but you can look at Marissa Mayer and what she's doing to Yahoo. She's rapidly buying up innovation. She's throwing 1,000 things at the wall and seeing what will stick because she knows that's her only chance to save that company, if you really want to save it, right? So I do think one advice to give is not to try to come up with one solution, but instead enable this company to have a culture where you can experiment, where you can move fast, where you're not afraid of failure, and learning to contain all of these things, because that's what even large-scale startups like Google is extremely good at. And I think that's the capability that lacks in a lot of companies. So that would probably be one thing. The other thing is, obviously I'm not saying go home and tear out your SAP system or your Oracle system or whatever, but I say maybe go back to figure out what these systems were really designed for. They were designed to be an accounting system. They were not designed to be your everyday work system. They were not designed to be your project management tools. All of these things that they sort of build out to become. And I think today, we are happily delivering all of this network data into this database. But it should not be the core of everything because the cost of change is just too high if you run your whole business on this.
The gentleman over here.
Thank you, Christian, for your talk. I'm feeling really good about myself, having picked up my new car last weekend. Perhaps some observations from yourself. Much of what you've talked about is sort of about physical businesses. Perhaps if you could talk about digital disruption and your views on the financial services industry and banking in particular. Much of those businesses were built on bricks and mortar branches, and digital is very much impacting their businesses. So some observations in that area, if you may.
So I think the biggest thing that's going to hit financial services and the whole financial industry is probably the growth of artificial intelligence. We're using machine learning, which is basically the same algorithms that Google used for Google Translate. We're using them for financial transactions right now, taking content from a PDF, a piece of paper, and turning it into data. Our algorithms is 2% better than humans in doing the same job. Last year, they were like 50% of what a human could do, so they've grown pretty fast. Oxford, they just did a study where they suggested that 49% of all white-collar jobs will be replaced by AI over the next 10 years. So if you think about how many decisions, how much stuff that's going on in finance that's about humans making decisions around relatively simple data sets, I think you can expect that to go away over the next 10 years, and completely. So I think if you think about that future world, where is the value add? What is it you can do that's separating you from the algorithms? Where is it you can deliver the value? And I think that's a really interesting question. I don't necessarily have the answer. The other thing is, you should probably forget about competing in infrastructure. It used to be, let's say, just the banks. They wanted to have their own networks. We still have the SWIFT network in Europe, which is extremely cumbersome, very, very expensive, very hard to change because banks running infrastructure is just a bad idea. And what I think will happen in the future is that banks or financial institutions should probably look at how can they become value adds on top of these mega platforms. And by mega platforms, I mean Google, Facebook. Facebook just took out a banking license, so they might be a competitor, but still the idea is the same. So I think lots of disruption happening in the process side, and that's completely going to change all of your businesses. So stay ahead of that, or others, they will do the same. And the other thing is figure out how you're going to utilize these new mega platforms and mega infrastructures, because running it yourself and trying to outcompete Facebook or Google is not possible.
So actually, let me ask a follow-on question to that. So in the financial industry, we've seen an incredibly array of complexity come in, and when something went wrong in a small part of it, you had a financial crisis and massive amounts of regulation come from the governments. If you're now looking at your future where nobody owns a car anymore, everything's an on-demand platform, that platform breaks down and all of a sudden nobody can get where they need to get going to is an equal disaster of a massive scale. So right now, society is not having much regulation on any of these platforms yet. When are they so big that they will need it, want it, that it will, how do you see that developing?
So I think, of course, regulation will hit those industries. And by the way, I think most of these large-scale companies now, they're also ready for it. Recently in the European Union, they said if it walks and talks like a bank, it probably is a bank. So I think a lot of this shadow banking going on, a lot of these new innovative finance services, they should certainly expect to be regulated just as banks very, very soon. But I don't think it changed the culture of these companies or the technology base or any of that. And I think, in fact, when it comes to regulation, I think the cloud platforms have it a lot easier than these old. I mean, one of the reasons there's such a high complexity is also because of the system base that has been built over the last 30, 40 years in the old financial industry is just so hugely complex. You can take a case like the Sony hack that happened. I was actually looking at that and all of the data that leaked and said, this would never, ever have happened if they were running Gmail. Never, ever. Two-factor authentication in Gmail, you couldn't have a hack like that happen. But they keep insisting that their own IT departments are better, that we can do this in-house. And I think that actually put them in a worse position, not in a better position. So I also think the technology base, the new technology base, is probably a lot better for regulation than the old one. It's centralized, it's cloud-based, it's real-time analytics. I can tell you real-time what happens with any given transaction. In fact, I'm running real-time compliance in 40 countries via software, which in the SAP world used to take an army of accountants. So I think that might be one of the things to think about. There's a disadvantage if you're not big enough to handle the cost of regulation, but on the other hand, the new technology platform give you a huge advantage when it comes to complying with it.
Mm-hmm. Is there another question from the audience? I think there's a gentleman over here.
There's innovation's always seen as a good thing for economic development generally. But there's been lots of debate recently about why innovation, the current round of innovation, should we say, is not increasing productivity. And is the reasons for that, for example, compared to, say, what the invention of electricity did, decades ago. So the question is really about, do you believe that is the case, or what's your view on that? And then secondly, a lot of what you described clearly is about new technology companies gouging the eyes out of the incumbents. Is it just a case that the mix of the pie is changing, but the overall pie isn't increasing?
So first off, I think the whole question around productivity is extremely flawed. I think it has to do with a very bad concept of what GDP is. Right now, GDP doesn't take into account free stuff. If you look at an amount of valuable free stuff that obviously have helped us do things better that the world have now versus 5 years ago, that is completely not measured by any GDP because we're looking at endpoint sales. So I think that's one thing. I think the model measuring it is wrong. I don't think that there haven't been a productivity increase. I just think that measuring productivity only in economical output is maybe wrong. I was talking to somebody at Google and discussing what we could do for them for running parts of their supply chain, and they had a really interesting comment, which was, we're not interested in lower cost of anything. I mean, it doesn't really matter so much, But what matters if I could save 15% of my employees' time, which is highly, highly, expensive people, so they can be more creative or think more or do more. But that's not readily measurable in, in a productivity gain necessarily. But it's a lot, for instance, for their talent pool and a lot of other things. So that was the first part of the question. I think the second part is, are we just changing the pie? No, I don't think so. I think there's a massive value creation. I especially think what you're going to see in the next 10 years as Moore's law seep out into the physical world is you will really see this starting to impact the overall pie in a lot of ways. I mean, we are very close to, for instance, solar power being sustainable. We need like 3 or 4 points more. And from a conversion perspective, it will be more efficient than almost all other energy forms. I think, machine learning, AI, will get us there within the next 10 years. So that will, of course, have huge impacts on society. I think in a lot of other areas, you will see the same. So I do think that pie will grow dramatically. And I think it already have. I just think the way we measure it is wrong.
Do we have another question from the audience? The gentleman over here.
Just thinking, obviously you go through a sort of laundry list of things to be disrupted or otherwise. What do you actually think isn't disruptable?
What isn't disruptable?
In terms of consumer behavior and so forth.
Government, probably, I don't know. and still some are, quite clearly. What isn't disruptable? I think there's some things we need to find solutions for, and I think one of them is jobs. Because right now, jobs is the main political capital. And if you look at, let's say, Oxford University's prediction that 49% of all white-collar jobs is going to be lost to AI. If we just run this as a normal cost-saving programs where all of the companies, they cut out these jobs, I mean, that's not sustainable for society. And I think that's one thing we're gonna think about. I come from a welfare state, Denmark, which is obviously have a very different model in dealing with all of these things. And I think we are gonna think really hard about what's the future of work. And I think, Silicon Valley, the technology community needs to get engaged in that debate rather than saying it doesn't exist. So maybe that's really one area. I think social structures ultimately are not disruptible. And I think what you've seen sort of historically is every single time you have around 30–40% youth unemployment in the country, really bad things start to happen to social structures fast. So I think that's one thing you've got to think on a bigger scale. But, yeah.
I had a follow-on question on that, and that's if you look at the benefit of some of these platforms having massive scale, even in something as simple as providing web infrastructure for a web service, and then having automated help for all the small companies that are buying it at GoDaddy or whoever else it may be. We were seeing a set of small business people here in Hong Kong who are almost terrified of being part of that, because if they are one of the small percentage of people where the tech support breaks down, they can't actually get hold of anybody. So they almost prefer to be with a local company where they can walk in and grab somebody and shake and say, why is my website down? Because it's the core of their life. If that website is down, they're not making money for themselves. So how are they being naive and they should just trust the better percentages of something ubiquitous over the web, or is there something in being able to walk in somewhere and shake somebody?
I think that is a trade-off. And obviously, if you are a mega platform, you've got to deal with scale in a highly automated way. I once read that there's around 400 people on the Gmail team, and they have 50 million accounts. Sorry, they have hundreds of million accounts today. They had 50 million accounts back then. So obviously, that's mega scale done through automation. But on the other hand, Gmail has probably collectively been down in the whole time it existed, less than a day, in the whole time period. So you're trading reliability. I think if you're going with smaller providers, everything used to be down quite frequently and things would be happening. So I think a lot of our fear from what can we do if something goes wrong is have to be traded with things that these new mega scales very rarely go wrong, because we have distributed architectures that are a lot more efficient today.
That's helpful, thanks. I think we have time for a couple more questions from the audience. The gentleman here.
Christian, may I ask you your take on Bitcoin? Is it here to stay?
So I think Bitcoin is one of the most interesting technologies to come out of technology the last 10 years. I don't think Bitcoin in itself. Bitcoin is a little bit like when Napster came out. Everybody remember Napster, right? And Napster in itself was not that interesting. But today, the technology that Napster pioneered, which was peer-to-peer, is powering everything. Netflix would not exist without Napster. Amazon wouldn't be able to do digital downloads. All of these things would not exist without the peer-to-peer. I think Bitcoin is the same. Bitcoin is the invention, and by the way, talk about something that will disrupt financials. Bitcoin is the invention of mediating value between two parties without having a third party generating trust. That's what it does. And you can apply that to anything where that's the case. Let's say a stock exchange, property records. So basically any kind of thing today that is mediated by a third party to generate trust, you can do with the blockchain protocol, which is underlying Bitcoin. So I think that's going to be that's going to be 10 times more disruptive than Bitcoin in itself, which is just one implementation of that technology. And I've already seen the first very large-scale companies who's, applying that. The rumor is right now also that IBM is coming out with their own protocol based on these technologies. I know at least of 2 companies who's building contract infrastructure, where you can do real-time escrow using the blockchain without having a third party and so on. So a lot of the stuff today that require a third-party validation of trust will probably fall to this over time.
Gentleman in the back there. Sorry.
Hey, Christian, can we get your thoughts on drone delivery?
On what, sorry?
Drone delivery.
I don't know. I honestly, I really don't. I think supply chains will be way more efficient. I don't know if that's a gimmick or will work. I think there's, of course, infrastructure problems, at least in the West, if you want to have drones flying around everywhere. They need to be a lot better. They will probably become it, but I don't know. Yeah. They're cool.
There's a gentleman over here.
If you think about some of the inputs and you talk about disruption, with obviously some of the medical disruption and the increases you're going to see, probably our kids living decades longer than we do. Can you talk about that input and what you think about that?
So healthcare is probably one of the areas that is benefiting the most from Moore's Law right now. And it's not just, there's some pretty scary stuff out there right now around real-time editing of DNA. And I know there was a group of scientists who just asked for a ban, the inventors of this, globally, because they don't know the consequences for the long run. But that's only possible because they can now crunch the data to actually figure out how this works. And obviously that's just going to get a lot better, which means our accuracy in these technologies will get a lot better, which means a lot of this stuff will get scary good fast. So I think another area within healthcare that is going to see significant boosts is predictive healthcare. And I think that will lower our healthcare cost dramatically. I was talking to a doctor, a professor at Berkeley, who said, in 5 years, I will be able to generate much more healthcare information about you from your iPhone than I will from your patient journal, because there's so many data points collected about your lifestyle, your health. The new Apple Watch will take your pulse every 5 minutes, just store it. So I think that's another area that will benefit heavily very, very soon. And I think predictive healthcare, of course, brings down the cost because we can do prevention rather than having to enact. But the long-term economical impact on stuff like life extension and so on, I think will be probably one of the areas where you will see government play an extremely active role, and I think you're going to have some huge ethical discussions around that. Some of the other things like sensors and so on is happening all around us right now. US insurance company Oscar is already offering you a rebate on your health insurance if you do more than 10,000 steps a day, monitored by your smartwatch or jawbone, right? So that's already here. It's happening.
Okay, I'm going to ask the final question then. When you're looking at very big supply chains, you're looking at a situation where brands still have value in customers, so you're saying, because there's a certain trust in the brand or in the quality, and even if everything else gets outsourced, the owner of their brand kind of vouches for it. What is an example of somebody else that will be able to correlate a lot of things behind them other than a brand, or will it all focus around brands in the end?
I think brands is an extremely important part of the equation, but they're going to remain and keep the trust. And I think brands that are diluting their trust is in huge trouble. And I think a good example was, when Steve Jobs, he joined the board of Disney, the first thing he said is, I don't want us to do merchandising with McDonald's, because that's diluting the trust in our brand. And the trust in our brand is worth far more than the merchandising deal we're getting from McDonald's. And I think that's absolutely the right decision, because long-term, as your supply chains get much more distributed, networked, I mean, a lot of these companies, they're nothing but the supply chain and the marketing department, really. And the trust is the only currency they have to remain relevant. So I want to say trust dilution is a very, very dangerous thing. I don't know. I mean, that's probably one example I can think of, yeah.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you very much, Christian.
Thank you.